Hi, everyone. I'll just wait a second for everyone to trickle in right now. Thank you all for joining this session. I'm really excited to be here today. I was in your shoes getting ready to apply to medical school 4 years ago, and it feels like it was yesterday. So I'll just start out by introducing myself. My name is Avery W, and I'm a rising fourth year medical student at UCSF, meaning I've taken step one, I finished my third year rotations, and I'll be starting my step two studying and my fourth year sub-Is in the spring. And I've been a medical school coach at Leland for almost 2 years now. So if you find that after this Q&A Ask Me Anything session, you have more questions or you want more personalized coaching on your medical school application, feel free to book a session with me and I'd be happy to work with you. And I know how difficult it is to navigate the medical school application process, especially when you don't have family in medicine. And so I'm just here to help you feel more confident about your next steps and answer all your questions. And I have a lot of insight about what medical schools look for in admitting applicants because I was an admitting interviewer for the current first year class at UCSF. So feel free to ask any questions about the different elements of the application, timeline things, my own personal experiences when applying, and put the questions in the chat so that I can kind of filter through and try to answer the most frequently asked questions. Okay, let's see. So, question is, does medical school take abroad shadowing hours? Yes, they do. Medical schools do like to see abroad shadowing, and they do accept those hours, and they'll accept that experience. Although it is important to prioritize shadowing doctors in the US just because they want to make sure you understand the US medical school system. And it's nice for you to have experience in US hospitals shadowing doctors in the US. But of course, those abroad experiences are lovely. And especially if you have an interest in global health, it's nice to see those things on your application. We have a question about should I feel discouraged if my stats do not exactly align with the school I'm applying to? So stats are really interesting with medical school. I think it can be daunting seeing the average GPA or average MCAT of a school. And one thing that someone told me when I was applying, I went to this research program at Johns Hopkins, and one of the doctors there said, a lot of people see the stats and they get really discouraged by the stats, so they end up not applying if they have lower stats than what's on the website. So it's kind of skewed because a lot of students with lower stats aren't applying once they see the average. So it's not necessarily that students with lower stats aren't getting in. It's really that they're just not even applying. So that's one thing to think about. And another thing is that the stats are kind of a guideline to tell you about the caliber of academic performance the school is looking for, but they are not everything. And most schools today are very holistic. So they will look through your whole application often before even deciding. So I think it can be helpful to see stats and use them as a benchmark or as a goal for your MCAT and your GPA. But when I think back to when I applied, out of I interviewed at 5 schools. Out of the 5 schools I interviewed at, all of them were either reach or target schools in my mind. And I didn't actually interview at any of the safety schools that I put on my list. And that tells you that those schools that I called safety, where my MCAT and GPA were either at their average or above, they didn't select me as an applicant. So it's not all about stats. They look at your passions, your experiences, and how your values might align with the school's values. So it's something to think about. You can use stats as a guideline, but don't use that to rule out a school or cross them off your list. Let's see. So this is a really good question, the timeline for going to medical school straight from undergrad. And it's really important to point this out because I think you're used to sort of finishing one stage of schooling and then being able to apply to the next stage towards the very end. But with the medical school application, it's a year-long process from when you submit your primary to when you start school. And so you're really having to submit your primary in which usually end of May or early June of your junior year. So it's a whole year before you would expect to apply. So that means really early on, you want to be thinking about which semester will be a good time to take your MCAT. When can you lighten the load to have time to study for the MCAT? You want to think about gathering those research and clinical experiences really early. You want to think about reaching out to people to write your rec letters early. So the timeline is primary application usually is submitted early June, ideally. And then you'll have secondaries rolling in over the summer. So like July, August, September. And then interviews will start rolling in usually by September. And that whole period from September until March or April the next year, that's interview time. And decisions will also come out within that period, usually on a rolling basis. Okay, let's see. So we have a question about, is shadowing a must when you have other experiences? I would say shadowing, I think, is most important for you to gain exposure to the medical field and make sure that medicine and medical school is really what you want to do. Um, it's not necessary if you have other clinical experience. So a lot of people will get experience doing things like being a medical scribe or an EMT or medical assistant. And so really the time that I would prioritize is time where you have direct patient contact. And sometimes, depends on who you're shadowing. Sometimes the shadowing can be more passive, where you don't feel like you're interacting with patients a ton. So I think of shadowing more for you, and I think of other clinical exposure for the school. So it's nice for you to get exposure to multiple fields, and to start to understand your interests in medicine and be sure this is the right field for you. But schools really want to see experiences where you're interacting directly with patients. And I think a lot of people also wonder, say, well, how do I have time to apply for, do the training for it and work in a medical field before medical school? So that clinical exposure does not necessarily have to be a medical job you have. My example of clinical experience was I was a tutor at UNC Hospital. So I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for undergrad, and I tutored K through 12 students that were in the hospital for long stays. So they consider that direct patient contact because I'm in a clinical setting and I'm also interfacing directly with patients. So those are the type of experiences that I would prioritize over shadowing, but both can be helpful for you. Let's see. This question is about, are there any topics that are taboo to talk about in personal statements? Um, I would say no to this question. I think the main things I would think about when writing your personal statement is, one, making sure this statement kind of aligns with your application as a whole. And so you generally want to have a theme for your application. And so you want to make sure that the story you're telling makes sense with the things that you're passionate about, like as seen through your activities. So that's one thing to think about. You also want to think about making sure the personal statement is not sort of a dump of all your research and clinical experiences. It shouldn't just be your resume, in an essay. You want to really tell a personal story, and you can highlight different elements um, of your resume or your application within that personal statement, but they already get a chance to see all the amazing things you do in the activity sections. So really make this a personal story about you and your growth and your journey to medical school. Okay. This is a question about how many publications we should aim for to apply for UCSF, since it's a research university. This is a really good question, because I think a lot of times people want to know numbers and like how many clinical hours do I need? What's the number of publications I need? When I applied to UCSF, I didn't have any publications. I think the big thing with research is having some form of finished product. And so for me, a lot of the research I engaged in were just really long projects that wouldn't be done during the time I was in undergrad. So it wasn't really feasible for me to get a publication. And so you can prioritize publications by being smart about the types of research projects you choose. but it's not necessary to have publications, even to get into big research universities. The main thing is having kind of any product of your research. So that could be abstracts, that could be publications, or that could be presentations at research conferences. So I did present at a few conferences and I submitted abstracts. So publications themselves are not necessary, but it is nice to have any product of the research that you've done. Okay, let's see, let's see. These are good questions, guys. Sorry, I'm just looking through. Okay, this is a great question about getting letters of recommendation. Um, so for one, you have to think about what your school offers. So some schools offer committee letters and they kind of all operate on different systems. Sometimes the school will put together the whole packet for you into a committee letter. Sometimes you'll have to still find your individual rec letter writers and get the letters, and then your school will compile a committee letter. And then for me at UNC, my school didn't have committee letters at all, so it was all on me to find my individual rec letter writers. So either way, you, for the most part, will need to look for individual rec letter writers, even if it's going to be formed into a committee letter. And so one thing to think about is how you initially build the relationship. So um, tips for, especially if you're at a big school with big lecture halls and you're, in a lecture with 400 people, it's good to ask questions in the lecture hall. I know it's scary to like be the one to raise your hand to answer a question or ask a question in the lecture hall, but it will make you stand out to a professor. And if you're more shy and it's really daunting to raise your hand in front of 300 people, then I would recommend going to office hours. Even if you don't have any specific questions, you can go to office hours just to say, hey, what's the best way to study for this class? Or ask the professor about their research experience and if they offer any research opportunities for students. So any way you can get one-on-one time with your professor or make it clear that you're making effort in their class, that's a good way to build a relationship. And then at the end of the year, or the end of that semester, it's good to solidify that relationship by sending an email saying how much you appreciate this professor's teaching and how much you learned from them. And so that's kind of your initial step to build that relationship. And then you want to maintain that relationship because you might meet a professor that you like your first year, and then you're not going to apply until junior year or maybe even later. So in this situation, it's good to get in the habit of emailing the professors that you want to write your rec letters and giving them kind of a summary or like an update of things that you've been doing since their class. This can be kind of like end of every semester, and it feels weird to just randomly email a professor and update them on your life when you haven't talked to them for a while. But trust me, this will make things a lot easier when it comes to asking for rec letters. You can, things to say in that email are research experiences that you've had, clinical experiences, or you can even kind of link what the professor taught you to what you're doing now. So if this was like an Orgo 1 professor, you can say, hey, the foundational knowledge I learned in your class was very helpful for Orgo 2. Thank you so much. So, any kind of update you can give that professor to maintain that relationship until you ask for that rec letter. And then when you're asking for rec letters, you want to make sure you're giving yourself a few months in advance. So, for example, if you're going to apply in June, I would probably start asking in like February because a lot of times um, professors will want some more information from you. Like they'll want your resume, and sometimes they'll even want a draft of your personal statement. So it's good to also start drafting your personal statement early so that you can have all the materials to give them and they have plenty of time to write you a good recommendation letter. Let's see. Oh, and there's a follow-up about how you approach rec letters when you're years out from college. So for if you're currently in college and you know you're not going to apply for a few years out of college, um, this is a situation where there are different platforms where you can actually save your rec letters for later. So um, Google those type of platforms. I don't have the name off the top of my head, but there are ways to ask for rec letters and keep them saved until it's time to use them. In a situation where you're already graduated from college, you're several years out, and you haven't talked to those professors in a while, you know, it's still not too late to start that connection even after college. Still give that update email, you know, tell the professor anything you remembered about their class, what you learned from them, and just explain that, hey, I just decided I wanted to go to medical school and I would love a rec letter from you. So I think it's okay, even if you kind of started late on building that relationship, it's okay to go back and get those letters. And there's also, aside from professors, it's good to ask any research mentors you've had, doctors that you've shadowed, or any mentor or advisor that has just had a longitudinal relationship with you and can speak to your character and your growth. Okay, let me just go through. Oh, this is a good question. What do medical schools think of virtual shadowing? So I would say with virtual shadowing, it's all about how you write it as an activity. For me, I was applying kind of right in the middle of the pandemic, so there was just limited opportunities for in-person shadowing. So at that time, schools were very accepting of virtual shadowing. But I think since then, it's become more popular because it's just, you know, it's allows access to everybody, and so schools are more accepting of virtual shadowing now. But again, it's all about how you write it as an activity. If you have great stories, great examples of cases that you heard, what you learned from that shadowing, and you're able to explain it in a way that shows that you really put a lot of thought and effort into the shadowing and you learn from it, then definitely that's going to be a great experience. And so for me, when I was framing my virtual shadowing in my activity section, I explained that I actually felt like I got more out of virtual shadowing than I did out of in-person shadowing, because with the virtual shadowing, there was kind of a chat box where you could talk to a group of students, where you kind of talk through the patient's history and physical exam, and you come up with a differential together, and then you answer that question in the chat, and you all discuss. So it was a lot more interactive, and you were able to ask more questions because often they were showing us recordings of old patients. It wasn't like a live shadowing experience, and so kind of the amount of engagement for me was a lot higher than it was with in-person shadowing, where sometimes a doctor is just really busy, a patient case is really complicated, and they can't explain it to you on the fly. So again, it's all about how you frame that activity on your application. Okay, let's see. Sorry, just going through. Oh yeah, question follow up on rec letters. Should I reach out first to a professor to establish our relationship, then ask for a rec letter later, or in the same email? It depends how soon you need that rec letter. So if this is someone that you've met freshman or sophomore year and you'll want a rec letter later, I would first reach out with that email of establishing the relationship or saying how much you enjoyed the class. And a lot of times professors, they're wise. They'll respond and say, hey, thank you so much. If you ever need a rec letter in the future, let me know, because they understand what we need as students. And so that's the ideal scenario, when you reach out and they already make the offer. But I would always reach out first to build a relationship if there's time. Now, if this is someone that you've met end of junior year and you're about to apply, or end of senior year, and you kind of need both to happen at the same time, I think it's totally fine to give the initial, I enjoyed your class so much. This is what I learned from you. And also, I'm applying to medical school. Would you be willing to write me a rec letter? So it's totally fine to do the ask with the relationship building email if you're short on time, and professors will understand that. But in those situations, you also want to be ready with your resume and a draft of your personal statement, because likely the very next question they'll ask you is for those two things. Okay, we have a question about preparing for medical school interviews. So with interviews, it's good to first know what type of interview you have, because prep for traditional interviews is a little bit different for prep for MMIs. And so first, within traditional interviews, you want to know if the interview is open or blind. And a lot of times they'll tell you that, or you can look it up online on the school's website. And so with a blind interview, that means that your interviewer has not read your application. And so they're going in blind. So they're waiting for you to tell them everything they need to know about you. And so you just want to be ready for those scenarios so that you make sure you tell that interviewer everything impressive about you. Make sure you try to sneak in all your clinical experience, research experience, and just know that they don't know anything about you and they're basing their decision off of what they hear in this interview. Now, with open interviews, this is when you want to make sure you know your application like the back of your hand, because this is a scenario where they might ask you specifics based on what you wrote in your application. And so, yeah, for those situations, you just want to make sure you know what you've done, you know your activities, and you can even have your resume or your application in the background, since most of these interviews will still be on Zoom. And so when prepping for traditional interviews, aside from knowing the format, the best thing you can do is kind of practice forming these answers, whether that be with a mock interviewer, and Leland offers mock interviews, or even if you record yourself and practice answering questions. It's just good to, one, practice verbalizing these responses, because you might feel like you have a really great answer in your head, but it's hard to like really spit out that cohesive answer when you're answering that question on the spot. And you also kind of want to look out for any like weird mannerisms you have, or kind of like nervous tics that you might do. And it's good to catch those things either by recording yourself or doing a mock interview beforehand. Now, with MMIs, there's just the style of questions you'll be asked is different. And so even if you Google or even ask Chat GPT some good MMI questions, it's just good to understand that style and practice in the style that the interview will be in. They'll usually tell you something like, okay, you'll have 5 minutes to think about each question, and then you'll have, 6 minutes to answer or something. Usually it's a little shorter, maybe 3 minutes to think about the question and 5 minutes to answer. And so just practice in the time frame that they give you for the MMI, and just look up practice questions for that scenario. And for MMIs, you also want to know like the principles of medical ethics. So that's just something that you can look up and study beforehand, because MMI questions will lean more towards ethical questions. Um, let's see. This question is it okay to not have letters from professors if we are several years out and have letters from mentors only? So this will depend on the school you're applying to. On AMCAS, you can just submit 10 rec letters total, or like max 10 rec letters, but they don't really specify. So when you're applying, you have to look at all the individual schools you're applying to and what they require to make sure all those letters are available on AMCAS. And they'll just pick and choose the letters that they want. So a lot of schools will say, we want 2 STEM professors and 1 non-STEM professor, and the rest of the letters are up to you. So it really depends on the specifics of your school. If a school doesn't specify, I think it's totally fine to have mentors or people from work or people who know you like more currently versus people who you knew from undergrad that's years out. But it might be required by that school to have professors from undergrad. Yes, thank you. Interfolio was the name of the platform where you can save your rec letters for later. Thank you. This question is, should each shadowing experience be its own activity? I would say it depends how long you were shadowing. Like if this was one shadowing experience, I would try to lump the shadowing together and talk about kind of generally what your role was in shadowing and what lessons you learned. in that shadowing experience and how that impacted you because you'd want to save, you get 15 activities total. And if you have room, I think it's okay to list shadowing experience on their own. But if you have more activities, I think it's better to condense the shadowing into one activity, especially if it was kind of only one shadowing experience in many different fields. Okay, let's see. The best time to practice interviews. Um, I mean, you can start as early as when you submit your primary, but I would say it is nice to get the interview invite first and know what style of interview you have, just so you're not wasting time. But I mean, it never hurts to practice general interview skills early, and you can always look up interview questions um, for both traditional and MMI interviews. And then, oh, sorry, for shadowing, should we lump all virtual shadowing together, for example? Yeah, I think it would be wise to lump the shadowing together. It's, it would be easier to do kind of a summary of how that virtual shadowing worked. And you can even, if you make it most meaningful, you might have room to pick out a key patient that was really impactful that you learned about or something that you'd never seen before, never heard before. But I think it's probably best to fill those activities with other things and try to condense the shadowing as much as you can. Let's see. For volunteering and clinical research on try to find research from San Francisco. Yeah, volunteering is always difficult to find. I would say if you're in San Francisco, looking at any big institution like UCSF, Stanford, they often will have their own volunteer opportunities or have links to like community volunteer opportunities that they've endorsed that you can apply to. But yeah, finding volunteering is always tough. If you're in undergrad, it's helpful if you join one of those pre-med societies or like a pre-med interest group or club, because they oftentimes will have recommendations on volunteer hours or even give you the actual volunteer experience and take you to those opportunities as well as shadowing. So if you're in undergrad, any pre-med organization or club that you can join can help with that. If you've graduated, then looking at any big universities or institutions in the area. Okay, let me go back through and see what questions I may have missed. Keep them coming. Does the research have to be in medicine? Uh, oh yeah, for research experiences, they definitely do not have to be medical research. They don't even have to be STEM research necessarily. A lot of times people will do research in things like education and how to design curriculums. So any research that you're passionate about is what you should do. And it's a bonus if you are choosing a project that you know can end in presenting at a conference or a publication or an abstract. But the field doesn't matter. They just want to see that you're passionate and that you're seeing a project through to the end. Let's see, let's see. Oh, okay. Since we are at 6:30, I will just end off with a few of my pro tips really quickly. So pro tip number one is when you're building your application, think about your niche within medicine. And so you want to tailor your application around that. And so, for example, you can have like community outreach and volunteering as the thing that you're passionate about. Maybe it's social justice, maybe it's teaching and mentoring, maybe it's research. And so you want to highlight this theme throughout your application in your activities and your personal statement. And so obviously you want to get experience in everything, like a little bit of research, a little bit of clinical experience, volunteering, but it's nice to be able to show what you're passionate about and highlight that theme throughout. And if your theme, for example, is like teaching and mentoring, You can highlight your leadership qualities when you talk about other activities like playing a sport, or maybe you talk about a research activity and you mention how you taught your research colleagues a new technique or how to analyze data. So just pick a theme based on what you're passionate about and try to highlight that so the the interviewer or reviewer can get a sense of who you are as an applicant. Remember to apply early because applications will come in on a rolling basis and you'll be admitted on a rolling basis. And so if you apply really late in a cycle, it's possible that a school has already admitted most of their class. So apply early. And just think about quality over quantity when you're applying to schools. There's a tendency to want to cast a wide net and apply to like 40 schools, but you have to think about the fact that 40 schools means 120 plus maybe secondary essays, and it's hard to do that many quality essays in 2 to 4 weeks. So those are my pro tips. Thank you all for listening, and feel free to book time with me on Leland. For during this session, I have a discount code for 20% off. So thank you so much. Have a good one.